Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and before I introduce today's guest, actually we are taping a few days ahead of the show, but it'll be great.
Always is. It always is.
It always is. But after Thinking Green for the next 3 weeks, starting the 13th and then the 20th and the 27th, Atlantic Broadband will be airing Nick Checker's old movie, Trashed, about homelessness and the Fort Trumbull eminent domain realities. And I think this movie is being brought back because the Little Pink House Hollywood movie is coming out now. And this might be a little more reality-based than what Hollywood is going to do with the story.
Is that about the same
So,
thing?
yes, so it is. And there was footage taken before the neighborhood was totally totaled. So if you're watching this in its regular time slot, you can stay on, and at 8 o'clock, the movie Trash will be shown for 3 weeks. So my guest tonight is Mike Alewitz. He's a New London-based political muralist, and he's been on the show before. And, well, we had decided that there were lots of things we could talk for an hour about, but my thought was that in today's climate, economic climate, talking about labor and the history of labor movements in the United States might be a good topic, partly because you've painted about it a lot, but partly also because so many of our economic ills are being blamed on organized labor right now. And I think we need a counter argument to some of that scapegoating.
Sure.
So I guess first of all, though, I wanted to ask you, did you get interested in the political side of your work first or the art side?
Well, I was, no, I went ass backwards. So I was a political activist. I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I was active in the labor movement, and actually went back to school when I was working as a third shift machinist making military equipment for General Electric up in Lynn, Massachusetts. And but I'd been a sign painter and a billboard painter. I had a background in the crafts. All those billboards along the freeways, those used to be hand painted. So I had a little background in it. But my mural painting was an offshoot of my political work, and it still is. It's a very utilitarian kind of art. I don't make precious objects for the wealthy. I don't make precious objects. I make murals that mostly get destroyed. I paint banners that get carried down the street. And it's a tool. And I love what I do. It's not for everybody. But, and I have used it because I was involved in the labor movement, have been involved with the labor movement. A lot of my work has paralleled all the developments over my almost 50 years in the labor movement. I've painted banners for a lot of the strikes and struggles for most of the big international unions. I've painted histories, and are going to be doing another one probably this summer in Providence, Rhode Island for 1199 healthcare workers. And I painted internationally. So I actually, in the course of, when I paint a mural, I really try to learn my material. I extensively research things, and I ended up actually teaching a labor history course at Rutgers University. First semester before they threw me out, but.
And of course, you taught more recently at Central Connecticut
I
State
taught mural painting and street art at Central Connecticut.
Now you mentioned, and I know you've done a whole show on your destroyed murals.
Yes. I am the most censored artist in the world that I know of. I don't think anybody comes close, actually. Most of my work's been destroyed, but you can see it documented at Red Square, my private museum here in New London. And anyone who's interested in this work and some of the stuff we'll talk about today can find me on Facebook and give me a shout.
Okay, so, and one of the things we had considered doing was a virtual tour
Yes.
of Red Square, which anyone who's driven along Broad Street, just as you are headed towards Hempstead, if you look a little to the left of Second Congregational Church, you can't miss it.
It's the old Learning Center.
And yeah, but I thought that since people can go and see it, you know, in person, if they get in touch
We're going to
with
talk
people,
about
we
some
can
of the
figure
some of the
that.
same things here today. It's all interrelated. So
Now, looking at your murals, I have to say I am not really knowledgeable about the labor movement. I worked in early childhood education, which is a field that needs to organize, but has been very resistant to organizing. So a lot of this is kind of new to me, but I started out looking at your albums on Facebook and saw a 5-panel, presentation, I guess, of related to the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. And it seemed like, the date was given in 1859, the first oil well was sunk in Pennsylvania, that a lot of organized labor kind of went hand in glove with the Industrial Revolution. So I don't know, I guess we should show these panels and you can talk
well,
about
maybe
some.
if I can just set a little framework for
Sure.
things, because most people don't know anything about labor history. In fact, most union officials have very little idea of their own history. The history of the labor movement has been so buried that just as before the advent of the civil rights movement, before we fought and won black studies programs, before the advent of the women's movement and we won women's studies programs, there really is an enormous lack of knowledge about the history of the labor movement. May Day, the international holiday of
Right.
the working class around the world. Nobody works around the world. You put your tools down on May 1st, except in the United States, where people don't know about May Day, although it's being reborn again. But May Day is a commemoration of the frame-up of the Haymarket Martyrs in Chicago. And the fight for the 8-hour day. It's a celebration of the militancy of the American labor movement. And the whole world celebrates it. And yet we have no knowledge of it. I always ask people, do you know about this thing? And no one does.
I did celebrate it during those 5 years that I lived on a kibbutz in Israel.
Okay, yeah.
And May Day was a bigger holiday than Rosh Hashanah, where I was.
The history of the North American labor movement is one of the most militant labor movements. There were armies of armed miners who fought for their rights. Thousands of armed miners. They still arm themselves to this day. Some of the greatest sit-down strikes and mobilizations and city takeovers everywhere. There's no place where this wasn't happening, and yet it's been completely buried. It's been completely buried. New London has a long history of labor militancy. I don't really know that much about it because I'm relatively new, but in every town, in every city, there were strikes and struggles to win free speech, which came out of the labor movement, to organize unions, to win decent working conditions such as they are. And as you pointed out, the development of the working class organization was tied into the development of capitalism. And here in places like New London, New Bedford, Providence, this whole area was one of the centers of that. A lot of it was led by children and women in the factories. A lot of these buildings that you go into, if you go into the old mill buildings stuff, people sometimes say, why are the rooms so small? They were built for children because a big part of the workforce was child labor. It was a very different world. There's a very proud and militant history. What I've tried to do in a lot of my murals is to be pedagogical and to put elements and history into my murals that people have to kind of question. So a lot of my murals, when you look at it, well, what's that about? And I've designed it so that people have to ask, so that you learn. What is a black cat symbol of? What is a wooden shoe a symbol of? What is that strange tower in the back? What is all these things? And you get a chance to explain about history. So I've produced a lot of these murals, but there's a lot more that need to be done. And if the labor movement is going to grow and survive, we have to relearn our history. It's a very important thing.
Now, even the labor movement has changed, though, because I think when you were on previously talking about your murals that had been censored or destroyed, sometimes it was the new union bosses who destroyed the work that was really celebrating the work of the people that came before them.
Well, we have during the greatest periods of labor organization, when the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, were organized, when the Congress of Industrial Organization, 1930s, this giant sit-down strikes, there were no labor officials. There were no staffs. There was nothing. It was workers. Workers. I painted a banner. I don't know if you included it. It says, unions don't organize workers. Workers organize unions.
No, I missed that.
But you see, this is the idea, and it's what some of us call business unionism. And what you had with the decline of organized labor through the 50s, there was a war on workers basically, was a growth of this big conservative bureaucracy. There's over 10,000 labor officials in the union movement today that make over $100,000 a year. They're millionaires. The heads of the major unions are millionaires. And then there's pecking order all the way down, and all of these union officials have inflated, they make much more than the members of their organizations, with few exceptions. And it has a conservatizing effect. And so what's happened is, instead of workers organizing to solve problems, it becomes this discussion between the officials and the employers. Now, you saw a grotesque example of this with the concession contracts pushed down the throats of state workers. The state workers had nothing to say about this. It was organized by the heads of the unions. It was a deal in the Democratic Party with the Democratic governor and legislature. And then the members are told to sign it. And when they rejected it, they came back and made them do it again. So yes, it's a problem. It's a problem that is going to, as the labor movement becomes reinvigorated, which it will, I believe it will, then we are going to have to deal with this problem of these conservative labor officials, because they will either be pushed to take action or we will roll over them. That's been the history of how these things happen.
And of course, they'll try to avoid that. But I'm also aware, Bob is a state retiree, and some things that have been imposed on him. He was an 1199 healthcare worker, which in 1980 was a pretty progressive union.
Well, some of the unions, there's basically, for those who are unfamiliar with the labor movement, there's basically two kinds of unions. There's craft unions and industrial unions. I happen to be a member of both. I'm a member of two unions. The craft union, United Scenic Artists Union, which I'm a member of, is a traditional craft union. That is, it organizes all the scenic artists. And so it's organized along craft. No matter where you work, if you're a scenic artist, then you might be in the Scenic Artists Union. Of course, most scenic artists aren't in the union. And it's actually a very militant union in the sense that it's maintained a lot of the traditional power of craft unions. We have a great contract compared to most people. And both with wages and benefits, because we're a Broadway and a movie, we're in entertainment. So, we're able, that industry is a section of it is very well organized, and it's very good in that respect. Then there's industrial unions, which are unions that are organized for everybody who work in a specific industry. In general, you might auto workers, whether you're a carpenter, a machinist, whatever. If you work in an auto factory, you're probably going to be in the United Auto Workers Union. And in that sense, being in the American Association of University Professors, which is sort of a union, in that sense, it's an industrial. It's with some craft aspects to it. So you have those two different kinds of unions. And 1199 and other similar unions have tended to be more progressive on social issues. They were one of the first unions to come out against the war in Vietnam. Because of the membership.
Well, I remember back in around 1980, one of the things they demanded was an objective work study that found that female-dominated jobs were less pay for more responsibility, more accountability, and it did have a somewhat equalizing effect on the wages between like the healthcare people and the state employees who worked for DOT, for example.
No matter how bureaucratized, no matter how weak, no matter how confused our unions are, they are extremely important organizations. They are the main line that prevents us from being pushed back into virtual slavery. And there are plenty of people in the ruling class of this country, and there is a ruling class, that would go back to the days when you worked an 80-hour week, when children worked, when women worked, and all that. And what stands in their way is the unions, as weakened as they are, and as problematical as they are. And if you are in some industries, like when I was painting billboards, having a union meant you stayed alive, because you had safety things enhanced, because if you didn't have those safety regulations, you're going to do a 90-foot fall, and you're not going to walk away from it. And in terms of dealing with unsafe conditions on the job, if you're a healthcare worker, there's all kinds of issues that you're faced with in terms of handling toxic materials or dangerous materials. There's a million things. Almost every job is dangerous, and having a union makes an extraordinary difference, not only for the union members, but for everyone, because a lot of healthcare workers are organized, it means healthcare workers who don't have union representation and collective bargaining, but the conditions are still raised for them as well. So unions are worth fighting for. We don't have to dump them. What we have to do is get involved and strengthen them and help to transform them.
Now let's look at one of your murals.
Okay.
Now this was the first one I found from the oil, chemical, and atomic workers. And it's 5 panels. I just, kind of copied and pasted each of the panels. So tell us about them.
Okay, well these are 5 panels. They're 7 feet by 10 feet. They're portable. I painted these
not in 1859.
No, not in 1859. But I think they were in the mid-90s or something. The oil, chemical, atomic workers no longer exists as a separate union. Like a lot of unions, it's been gobbled up in these unions. Union bureaucrats love to have these mergers because it makes it look like your union's growing.
That's actually kind of just like corporate America, right? You have the mergers, so you...
Yeah. Well, they have a lot of these officials have a corporate outlook on things. But the oil, chemical, atomic workers was actually really the most progressive union at the time, in the late 80s, 90s. They were the ones who were really behind the initiative to start a labor party. There was Tony Mazzocchi was a leader of the OCAW, and the OCAW, some sections of the mine workers, other energy unions, were really behind the push to start a labor party. And that's included in the imagery here. And what they did, and this was what every union should do, not necessarily with me, but I painted 5 panels which portrayed the history of the union. And then they made a booklet out of it so the members could read and learn about the history of their union. And so within that, there's all kinds of images, not just about the OCAW specifically, but about the development of American labor as a whole. Because really the vision of most of those who built the unions was not that it was an institution that protected the members. It did that, but it also spoke on behalf of all workers. In other words, you don't just fight for a health care plan for your union, but
Right.
you fight for national health care.
Right.
You speak for all workers. So in this panel, for example, the first one, it says organize the unorganized, you see a picture of Eugene Debs and Mother Jones. Eugene Debs, who ran, I put him in there, he ran for president while he was in prison for opposing World War I. Vote for convict number, I forget the number, but he's in there. You see in the background the Ludlow massacre, where state militia fired on striking miners and burned people alive in their tents. You see the industrial workers of the world there in the background. There's lots of things there, and it would take hours and hours to explain all of it. But the idea is, looking at this, only a handful of people would know what this was. And so you have to ask and then get involved and try to figure it out. So that's panel one. I don't know if you have all of these.
I have all of them.
Okay. Well, we don't, but I'll just point a couple of things out in these. We can go through them a little quicker. But here in the center you have John L. Lewis, who was the president of the Mine Workers Union, who helped to form the Congress of Industrial organizations. The big unions and the main gains that were made came out of very militant struggles, mostly during the 1930s, with big sit-down strikes where workers occupied the factories. And this was very widespread. If you ever want to have some fun, you go back and you find a 1937 newspaper, and you turn the page. Here's the local drugstore women who organized the sit-down. They chased the boss out. Here's strike moving. That's all that was happening. Included in this also, you see Martin Luther King in the background, I forget what the incident in front of it is, but people, they've tried to sanitize Martin Luther King as a guy who said, "I have a dream," and he was for peace and whatever. He was a militant fighter and a labor activist. He was supporting the striking sanitation workers when he was killed. He was a militant fighter. He was nonviolent, but he was certainly not non-struggle. So the brochure explains a little bit about that. You can move on to the next one. Union power. Here, this is mostly about the history of the oil, chemical, atomic workers. 32 for 40 or fight was a slogan that came out during World War II. Unfortunately, a lot of the unions became very chauvinist and pro-war and signed away. They had no strike pledges, things like that. And the workers were demanding, this was part of the struggle. There was a big strike wave after World War II because workers were demanding, now that the war was over, that they lift the wage freezes, and that they were some of the largest strikes in U.S. history, demanding better wages and working conditions. We can move on to the next one. This is Karen Silkwood, who was an oil, chemical, and atomic workers activist. And there's a movie, Silkwood, which people can watch probably. It's been a while, so most people wouldn't know. But she was an atomic worker who helped to expose what was happening in her plant and died under very mysterious circumstances, probably murdered by a Carnegie Company. But there's a movie, it's pretty good, with, what's her name?
Meryl Streep.
Meryl Streep playing Karen Silkwood.
Which
And
kind of tells you how old the movie is.
yeah. And, I wanted to paint her, and this whole panel was dedicated to Karen Silkwood, because Karen Silkwood is a very good example of how one worker, can make such a difference. Because we're told continuously from the day we're born, you're powerless. You can't fight City Hall. You can't change things. But people do. Karen Silkwood made an enormous contribution by putting the interests of her coworkers and the community over the interests of herself and the company. And she was willing to do this. She paid the ultimate price for this. And a lot of people have paid that price. The history of the labor movement is a very bloody history. And the ruling class of this country is willing, just as they're willing to slaughter people abroad, they're willing to slaughter people here, because they don't see a difference. It's all workers. We're workers. Only when only when they want you to fight are you suddenly an American. The rest of the time you're working.
Well, that's a recurring theme in your work, which we'll talk about afterwards, I think, is that because workers are all workers, there needs to be solidarity across national lines, across racial lines, because we know that the ruling class, they all know each other.
They don't have any patriotism. The ruling class of this country, the Bush family, for example, made their fortune trading with laundering money for Nazis. All the big corporations did work, sold armaments to both sides in World War II. It's a shell game. Meanwhile, they're giving patriotic speeches, and Trump wants to have a military parade.
Oh yeah, I saw that in today's news.
I think we're going to have big demonstrations that day if that happens. But yeah, we're workers. We're workers. They tell you you're an American. What does that mean? It means you were born with a line around you somewhere. Malcolm X said, and I painted a banner that says this with Malcolm X's image on it. It says, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I don't even consider myself an American. I'm one of the victims of Americanism. And that's what we are. We're the victims of Americanism. The idea that we're special is inculcated into us all throughout our lives. It's hammered, hammered, and hammered. You're special. America's special. The U.S. is different. We're unique. Well, that's nonsense.
It seems like we're hearing more of that right now also. And to me, it's always just seemed like where you're born, the circumstances of your birth, it's like it's not a source of pride or shame or anything in of itself. It had nothing to do with us.
No, and you have nothing. You don't get to choose, and of course, the ruling classes of every country say that about their country.
Well, everyone wants to feel special, right?
Yes. And we should, because we're workers. We should feel special because we're workers. And that's the thing. We're taught that if you're a worker, that you don't have value. You turn on the TV, and it's. Who's on TV? Shows about lawyers, shows about cops. You never see a worker. There's no workers on TV. And when there is a worker, they're a goofy buffoon, the fat plumber, and instead of showing a plumber for what they really do, which is they keep us from getting sick, they basically keep in place a system that prevents disease. Instead of showing janitors who keep us from getting disease, well, they don't do that. They show a doctor who basically profits off of the misery of human beings, and the lawyer who profits off of the misery of human beings. And we're told that workers are valueless. But workers are special. They really are. And I've had the fortune to paint for all kinds of workers, textile workers and healthcare workers and miners and whatever. And it's a wonderful experience. And I feel very, very lucky to have done that.
It seems like, and I don't really want to get off track with this, but you even look at city budgets and state budgets, and infrastructure stuff is really not given the value it deserves in terms of spending priorities.
No. We are here, in the eyes of the ruling class, we're here to make money for them. That's our only purpose. And everything is structured to do that. I mean, all we have to do is look at what they've done to this state, which is awash in money. 7.5% of the households in Connecticut are millionaire households. If you took the four richest hedge funds operators and let them keep $2 billion and tax the rest, we would have free education and free health care for everyone in the state. That's how much money they have. And yet they just stole more from state workers and from taxpayers to give to the super rich, because it's never enough. It's a systemic problem of capitalism.
Okay, so with
Back
that,
to the,
here's the
back to the labor movement.
Yes, this is the last panel
Yes.
in that particular series.
Yeah, and this was, it says a party of labor in the streets and a party of labor at the ballot box. And the religion of this country, and the wonderful thing about the OCAW was they were for starting a labor party because they understood that the Democratic Party is a party for the employers, just like the Republicans are. They can't lose in the elections. If Clinton wins or Trump wins, it doesn't matter because they both answer to the ruling class. And whatever, as Deb's pointed out, whatever differences they have are just differences over how you're going to cut up the spoils of your theft. And the OCAW understood that you need a labor party that's independent of the employers to organize people in the streets, because that's where real change takes place, and to use the elections to challenge the Democrats and Republicans to run independent labor campaigns that speak on behalf of workers. The reason we don't have national health care and some of the other benefits that some of the Western European countries, or even countries like Mexico and Colombia have, is because we don't have a labor party. If we had a labor party, an organization that could fight for national health care, we could win it. It's certainly winnable.
And we could start in Connecticut.
We could. Good.
There's money in Connecticut,
There's...
and in the long run, it would save. And can you imagine, even the business-oriented politicians, legislators, if Connecticut had a state healthcare system, businesses would want to be here, especially small businesses.
Yes. Well, as we know, politicians and capitalists can't see beyond the immediate profit. Lenin said, the capitalists will sell you the rope you're going to hang them with. And you see that absolutely here.
It is frustrating to me. I mean, I'm a grandmother now, and these people have grandkids. So what kind of world do they want their grandkids to live in?
Well, they're going to steal enough so that their grandkids are taken care of. They can't see beyond today. They can't see beyond the immediate profit.
So I have some slides, and we'll just go through them really quickly so people can get a little bit more of a sense of your work. And this is mine workers, and this was a very long mural. I don't know how long it was, but it's on your Facebook page.
Do you have, can you go through it?
I do.
Oh, okay.
So, yes, and I think I have them in the right sequence.
Okay. Well, yes, that you're starting on the left-hand
so
side. This was a 100-foot-long banner that I painted for the 100th anniversary of the United Mine Workers Union. Very militant history. Of course, the mining and a lot of other industries were very labor-intensive.
And very dangerous.
Very dangerous, and the miners were, one of the biggest unions in the country. There were millions of miners. There were millions of textile workers. Even when I was, 40 years ago in this country, even 30 years ago, you still had big factories, big plants. You had big auto factories. You had big shipbuilding things. I worked as a machinist at General Electric. There were 8,000 workers in the plant. There were places like Sparrows Point that had 50,000 workers in one. This is all gone. This is all gone. I went to Kent State, and you had Akron, which was the rubber capital of the world. You had Youngstown, which was the steel capital. You had, this is all gone. Well, mining was a key part of the fight for industrial unions. Very militant history in the mine workers. And hundreds of thousands of miners were involved in this enormous social struggles that transformed the country. And here you see, as you travel the mural, you see there's a canary in there, and the canary goes from scene to scene. This is miners at Ludlow, where the camp was attacked. I spoke about that briefly before. This is the UAW's the sit-down strike in Flint, Michigan, very militant chapter in labor history. And you see workers inside when the mass sit-down strikes took place, the workers self-organized educational and cultural activities. They had classes inside the factories. They formed orchestras. They had poetry readings. There was very rich cultural life, and they had committees. They had postal committees, and they had justice committees that would, if anyone misbehaved or destroyed anything that was inside the factory, they're very careful not to do that. You know, they would have a trial. And they'd say, well, you can't do that, and if you keep it up, we're going to throw you out of here. And they organized these things collectively. They had women's auxiliaries that played a key role in these struggles. And it transformed people's lives. So that was, and the CIO, which the miners were key in starting, helped to organize the Flint sit-down strikes. And this is a miner's funeral, and the band that's going through are all the disasters, because there's been thousands of mining disasters, a very, very dangerous job, and still is a dangerous job for, although it's much improved in the U.S. because of unions, internationally still it remains, it's just a bloodbath. And
so no wonder that the miners would not be fearful of being overly militant.
Yeah, no, it was, and a lot of it was child labor. You had the breaker boys that would pick through the coal, and of course you had black lung disease and all this kind of stuff, and of course now mining is largely mechanized, and like a lot of other industries, this nonsense about, well, you know, Trump says that we're going to get coal mines, that's absolutely nonsense. Coal miners don't mine with picks and shovels. They use advanced computerized equipment, and even if they widely expand coal production, they're basically doing it with heavy equipment and removing mountaintops and big machines that do this stuff. There's not going to be any jobs, and they know there's not going to be any jobs. That's absolute nonsense.
Well, I know I went to a program at UConn several years ago, and they were talking about converting our economy to non-military uses and non-fossil fuel uses. And you get more jobs for the expenditure in many other fields, in healthcare and education, in the trades that you have to, you know, you can't outsource plumbing.
It's totally doable. And in fact, there's an example, because when the U.S. entered World War II, and this was a fight over markets, had nothing to do with freedom, and you know, this was just who's going to get the goods. The U.S. had very little in the way of an army at the beginning of World War II. Overnight, American industry was militarized and transformed, and they overnight began to build tens of thousands of bombers. Everything went into making bombers and artillery and armaments and weapons, and they just, within a year, they were just churning out all this stuff. You know, Henry Ford, who was a Nazi sympathizer, realized, oh, I can make money doing this, and they started making airplanes, which are, you know, bombers, which are the great thing about war from the point of view of the capitalist is you drop bombs, it means the planes get shot at you, you make more planes. The fact that people die in all this doesn't matter to them. They're making a lot of money. And you could do the same thing in reverse. You could go over to Groton, and instead of making nuclear submarines that have the potential to destroy the world, you could make public transportation. You have millwrights, you have machinists, you have welders.
Didn't they start out making trolleys there, trolley cars?
That's very possible. There were trolleys. The trolleys system in the United States was extensive. You could, E.L. Doctorow in one of his books describes, you could get on a trolley car in Boston and for a dime and ride it to New York because you could just keep transferring. There were electric trolleys in New London. Trolleys were everywhere. Well, the rubber and oil and automobile industries bought them and destroyed them. And so what we end up with today is massive underwriting, not of public transportation, but of these private corporations making money. You know, because they say, well, we got to get rid of train service because, you know, it's not profitable.
Which is a hot topic right now.
Sure. Well, because, and I worked on I actually helped lay tracks through New London because I was a track worker many years ago. And, you know, they say, well, you have to underwrite. Well, you underwrite any kind of transportation. The auto industry we pay hundreds of billions of dollars to build superhighways and all this kind of crap. And that's a gift to the automobile makers and the rubber manufacturers and the oil industry. And if you took that same money and built a rail system that was usable, then you wouldn't have these problems. You could solve that problem overnight too. It doesn't take long to build rail systems relative to other things.
No, and honestly, we have most of the track here already.
Yeah.
So there
Well,
would
and
be
it-
some upgrades, but
And
we
it
don't
would
have to
be
start from
jobs,
scratch.
and it would be a lot of jobs to do it. And you'd end up with a safer, cleaner, more efficient method of transportation. Instead of every human being have to pay $20,000 or $30,000 for an automobile, which is insane. You know, and you go to Mexico. You go to Mexico City, which is very poor. And for less than the cost of the tickets that they print, you have a gorgeous subway system that takes you anywhere, and just one after another.
Wow.
You know, these things are. The problem in the United States is not that we couldn't do these things. We could solve most of our social problems overnight. The problem is that it's not profitable to do so. The first thing you would do to solve the energy crisis is you would reduce the work week. You would work a 6-hour day. The metal workers in Germany just want a 28-hour work week.
Wow.
And here we're working 2-3 jobs. It's insane.
So we have a couple more slides
Yeah,
to
let's look at some art.
get the rest of that banner.
Yeah, get the
It's-
guys. You can just go through that.
Yeah.
We'll go on to something else. It's too.
Yes. Okay, and that's the
That's
last
the end of
one.
it. Yeah. If
Okay.
anybody wants to get the story of this, they can go to my Facebook page. And
Yeah,
find
if you
it.
just do a search on
Yeah.
Mike Alewitz. you
Yeah,
find-
there's because you have to read a little bit about it, and it's a very rich history and a very inspiring history, you know, because when you read these things and you read how ordinary people created these changes, then you realize, oh, we can do this. And we can do this. And of course, our generation did it too. We ended the war in Vietnam. We won some, important gains in the civil rights for African Americans. We have accomplished. And unfortunately, in the last couple of decades, there hasn't been a lot of victories. So
No, there haven't. And going through the various murals and banners you've done, the movement also went. You have a series on the mushroom strike. Needle workers, the garment industry. So things that seem like they might have started with things, coal, oil, energy, that really industrial side. There really isn't any line of work that is not part of that.
yeah, and the labor movement, even during periods that seem quiescent like today, there's actually a lot of stuff going on, but you don't see it. And part of that, and something that's very, very important, is discussion that goes on among workers. The largest class-conscious demonstration in the United States was not in the 1930s. It was in the May Day demonstration of immigrant workers in 2006. And when you said a year before that there's going to be this huge thing, millions of workers are going to come into the streets with a banner that says, "We're not criminals, we're workers," people thought you were crazy. But it happened. Immigrant workers, who are the most at risk, organized these huge demonstrations, amazing spectacle, bigger than any of the anti-war demonstrations. And class conscious, that is, understanding this is a workers' demonstration. And if that happened today, it wouldn't be just immigrant workers. I think everybody would be out there. Because people are very dissatisfied. The anger has not gone away. People haven't grown conservative.
No, it's still misdirected, though.
Well, yes. Well, it pops up here and there. It pops up in the women's demonstrations after Trump's inauguration. And, you know, there's little things that happen. Here in Connecticut, hotel workers are organizing in Stamford. They win a little victory. And, and a lot of what's going on is that people are trying to figure out how to proceed. And that kind of period where a lot of discussion takes place has always gone on before big actions. When the stock market crashed in 1928, there were no demonstrations. In fact, they'd have a job and workers would go and beat each other up trying to get the job. It was totally...
And that might be sort of where we are right now.
Well, in a sense, yeah. People are still trying to figure out individual solutions. You know, I was teaching art, right? And you get art students and say, well, I'm going to get out of here, I'm going to go into nursing, right? And then they go into nursing and then the market's flooded with nurses. Or I'm going to become a computer programmer, or I'm going to do this. And then they give up and they go, well, I'll be a yoga instructor or a chef. So I'll be very poor, but I'll do something that I like. But you see, it's all thinking me. How do I solve this? We haven't gotten to the point where people are willing to act collectively, where they understand, no, the problem isn't me. The reason I'm homeless isn't because I did something wrong. The reason I don't have a job isn't because I did something wrong. The reason all of us begin to understand, no, it's a societal problem. And that if we act together, we can begin to fight it. And the minute we start to do that, that's the beginning of wisdom. And the fact is that workers today have more potential power than at any time in history. You know, a handful of workers. I worked on the railroad, right? Any one of the dozen railroad brotherhoods, the signalmen, if they decide to go on strike, the other railroad workers honor the picket line, everything in this country will shut down. If electrical workers go on strike, everything will shut down. That's how much potential power we have.
I think that we don't really use that power very much. I see a lot of weekend demonstrations that are timed to not be disruptive, and I think, oh, is it worth it or not?
Well,
and it is worth it, but it doesn't do as much as it could.
It will happen. It will happen because it's a pressure cooker. You know, because the ruling class can't control their impulses, either sexually or economically. They keep coming back for more. You take from the state workers, and the workers don't put up a fight. So what do? Well, of course you come back for more, and you come back for more. Well, eventually somebody stands up in a meeting or in a classroom or in a factory, and they say, "I'm sick of this crap." And you know,
I'm not going to take it anymore.
What was the movie with Sally Fields? She holds up the sign, and in fact, that's what happens. That's what happens. At some point, people can't take it anymore, and some incident can spark it or whatever. But it's not that people have grown complacent. It's that people haven't yet. It hasn't gotten to the point where it's going to be a collective outburst. Now, when it does, you'll see something like Arab Spring. It went on Facebook, and the next thing you know, millions of people are out in the street. Now, you and I are used to organizing in a different way. You don't have to go out and hand out flyers on the street corner now.
Not anymore.
Just go online. So I believe that there's going to be huge fights ahead of us, because one of these days, it's all going to blow up.
Now, one of the recurring themes I saw in a lot of your work that was done in many places throughout the world was the idea that solidarity has to break down barriers. So maybe, we were originally going to talk about your project, mural project in Palestine, and maybe we only have about 5 minutes, but maybe you can talk about the motivation behind that.
Well, it's because this is one of the things that we ideologically, one of the main battles that we have to fight. I think there's a couple of things that the ruling class has really tried to convince people of in this country. One is that elections matter, which they don't. Election is theater, and it doesn't change, and no election has ever changed anything. But people believe in them, and it's the real religion of this country, not Christianity. It's electoralism. And the other thing is the idea that you're an American and that you're not a worker. And in fact, oil workers in the United States are the same as oil workers in Iran and oil workers in in Nigeria and oil workers anywhere else. And I've traveled to all these places, and I've been to countries like Cuba and in countries that are under the gun, an embargo of the U.S. There's never a problem between artists. There's never a problem between carpenters. There's never a problem between workers. And people understand that. You know, they welcome you. I've worked in places that are basically at war with the United States, and they know I'm not the government, and I'm opposed to the government. And so, yes, we have to build these bonds of solidarity, and there's some unions that are doing that and trying to do that. I did a cross-border project with the electrical workers, one a mural in Chicago and a mural in Mexico City, and the idea was a thing. And a lot of my work is designed to do that, to build the idea of solidarity, that we are all workers, and if we act together, our power is unlimited, because we are the ones who produce everything. We don't need the boss needs us. And there have been times when that kind of international solidarity has played an enormous role in the advancement of the social struggles for peace and justice. There were times when longshoremen in the United States refused to load war goods that were directed against the Russian Revolution, for example. We have to revive a lot of those traditions.
And of course, from your point of view, it's a merging of the arts as well as labor. Well, I think we're out of time. So maybe we'll let people know how they can find out more about you and maybe come and see what you've got.
Well, just
here
go
in
to
London.
Alewitz. There are no other Alewitzes on Facebook, Alewitz, so I'm easy to find. There's a lot of stuff going on, and if you go to my site, you'll see a lot of the murals that students have painted, that I've painted around the world and whatever. And if you're interested in getting involved in some of these things, I can try to get you hooked up. We have to build solidarity locally, nationally, internationally. The only thing that stands between us and the destruction of the human species is human solidarity, because otherwise they are continuing to lead us down a path of this carbon-based suicide. And but we have the potential power to stop that. We can create a new world. It will not be easy. I probably won't be around to see it, but we can do it.
And New London is an interesting place to be
It's a
taking
great
part
place.
in it.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll see you next week. Maggie Redfern will be on the show talking about goings-on at the Arboretum.
Well, she should talk about her lawn, too.
Maybe she will.
What we